It started on an ordinary Friday evening with a crimson sun dipping below the horizon, casting the university campus in a warm, fading glow. The air smelled faintly of rain, a promise that the clouds gathering in the distance might fulfill. I was seated in the library, immersed in notes from the past week's lectures, trying to keep my focus on the dense academic texts before me. Then came the soft click of heels against the marble floors, sharp and precise, stopping just shy of my desk. I looked up, startled to find Professor Hartley standing there, her figure silhouetted against the dimming light of the large windows. She was a vision, dressed in a black pencil skirt that hugged her form and a crisp, light blouse that hinted at the strength beneath her refined exterior. Her auburn hair was tied back in a loose bun, with a few stray tendrils framing her face. "Elise," she said, her voice as smooth as the pages of the leather-bound tomes that surrounded us. "Still here so late?" "Yeah," I cleared my throat, feeling a blush creep up my neck. "Just trying to catch up, Professor." Her smile was faint but disarming, and she leaned slightly against the desk. The scent of her perfume, light, floral, intoxicating, wafted over me. "You are one of the few who does," she murmured. "There's something admirable about your dedication." I tried not to let the compliment unbalance me, though her gaze had a weight to it that was hard to ignore. "Thank you," I managed, offering a small smile. Her head tilted slightly, as though she was considering something. Then after a moment of silence, she said, "The archives room. You know where that is, don't you?" I blinked. "Yes, I think so. There's a collection I need reviewed, and I believe you'd be the perfect candidate to assist me. If you have time now, of course." Her tone was light, almost casual, but there was an undercurrent of something more. I hesitated, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was already nearing 8, and the library was emptying out. But the chance to work one-on-one with Professor Hartley was too enticing to pass up. "I'd be happy to help." Her smile deepened, and she gestured for me to follow. "Good. Come with me." We navigated the dim hallways, the sound of our footsteps echoing softly as we made our way to the archives. The space was secluded, far from the bustling main library, and the air grew cooler as we descended a set of stairs. When we arrived, Professor Hartley unlocked the door with a key she retrieved from her pocket. The room was smaller than I expected, with towering shelves crammed full of aged books and manuscripts. A single desk sat in the center, illuminated by a desk lamp that cast long shadows across the floor. "It's a bit dusty," she remarked, stepping inside and gesturing for me to follow, "but it's one of the most fascinating places on campus." I nodded, though I couldn't stop my eyes from drifting to her as she moved about the room. There was a natural grace to her, an effortless command of space that made it hard to focus on anything else. She picked up a thick, leather-bound book from one of the shelves and placed it on the desk. "This," she said, "is the one I need your thoughts on. The content is, let's say, layered. I'd like to hear your perspective." I sat down, brushing off the chair's surface, and opened the book. The pages were delicate, yellowed with age, and filled with intricate illustrations. As I skimmed the text, I felt her presence behind me. Close, almost too close. Her hand rested on the back of my chair as she leaned in to point at something on the page. "Here," she said softly, her voice so close to my ear that I shivered. "This passage is particularly interesting, don't you think?" I turned to look at her, startled to find her gaze already fixed on me. There was something in her eyes, a glimmer of curiosity, of intensity, that made my breath catch. Her gaze lingered, unyielding yet not oppressive, an invitation to acknowledge what simmered beneath the surface. It was as though the very air in the archives room had thickened, the scent of aged parchment mingling with her light perfume to create a heady, almost intoxicating atmosphere. Yes, I said finally, though my voice was softer than I intended. The passage seems layered, like you said. There's a lot to interpret. She smiled faintly, her lips curving in a way that felt both approving and conspiratorial. Indeed, interpretation is a skill. It requires intuition as much as intellect. Some can see what lies beneath the surface. Her voice dropped, becoming almost a murmur, while others only skim along the top. I swallowed, unsure of how to respond. The proximity of her was overwhelming, her hand still resting on the back of my chair, her fingers barely brushing the fabric of my sweater. It was a simple touch, unremarkable to anyone else, but to me, it might as well have been a spark. Do you see beneath, Elise? She asked suddenly, her tone softer, now almost coaxing. I looked at the page, though the words had blurred into meaningless shapes. I try to. Good, she said, and there was something in the way she said it, an edge that made me shiver. Trying is the first step to understanding. Her hand shifted then, the movement deliberate as she let her fingers trail briefly along my shoulder before stepping away. I felt the absence of her immediately, the cool air rushing in to replace the warmth of her presence. You'll want to take your time with this, she continued, as though the moment hadn't happened. There's no rush. I nodded, grateful for the reprieve, though my pulse was still racing. She moved around the desk, standing on the other side and leaning forward slightly. Her blouse gaped just enough to reveal the delicate chain of a necklace resting against her skin. So, she said, tilting her head as she regarded me. Tell me what you see. I forced myself to focus on the page, the intricate illustrations and text that sprawled across it. The image depicted a figure, angelic, yet unnerving, with sharp, angular features and wings that seemed too jagged to belong to something divine. Around it, smaller figures knelt in adoration or fear. It was hard to tell which. It's ambiguous, I began hesitantly. The central figure could be seen as a savior or a threat, depending on how you interpret their posture and expression. And the kneeling figures, do they kneel in submission? She interrupted, her voice low and velvety, or in reverence. My mouth felt dry as I glanced up at her. It could be either, or both. Her eyes gleamed and she straightened, brushing an invisible speck from her blouse. An excellent observation. Duality is often at the heart of these kinds of works. It's what makes them so compelling. I nodded, though I could barely process her words. My thoughts were too scattered, my senses too attuned to the faint scrape of her heel against the floor as she moved, the way her shadow flickered against the wall as she adjusted the lamp's angle. For a while we worked in silence, or rather, I worked while she observed, her presence as constant and consuming as the book in front of me. Occasionally, she would ask a question or point out a detail, her tone thoughtful, until the soft aromas of the library reached my nose, something that set my nerves alight. At one point, she leaned across the desk to retrieve another book, her arm brushing mine in a way that felt far too intentional to be accidental. I froze, acutely aware of the faint warmth of her skin against mine, but she didn't seem to notice, or perhaps she did and simply chose not to acknowledge it. Elise, she said, after what felt like an eternity, you've been very helpful tonight. I hear you all playing tonight, and it feels great. I'm so glad all of you can be here tonight. I feel so glad. I looked up, startled by the sudden shift in her tone. She was standing closer now, her gaze steady and unwavering. I thank you, Professor. I'm glad to help. Her smile returned, softer this time, and she reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face, with a touch so light it sent shivers down my spine. You don't have to call me Professor, she said. Not here. My breath hitched, and I struggled to find my voice. What, uh, what should I call you? Her smile deepened, and she tilted her head slightly, as though considering her answer. Hartley will do. For now. Do you enjoy this, Elise? She asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. I blinked, startled. What do you mean? She stepped closer, her gaze never leaving mine. Being here, with me. My heart was pounding now, and I couldn't bring myself to look away. Yes, I do. For a moment, she said nothing, simply watching me with that same unreadable expression. Then, slowly, she reached out, her fingers brushing against mine, where they rested on the edge of the desk. The touch was fleeting, almost hesitant, but it was enough to send a jolt of electricity through me. No, I lied, though my voice betrayed me. Her smile widened and she leaned in slightly, her gaze holding mine captive. Good, there's no need to be. Her words hung in the air, each syllable sinking into me as though they had weight. I wanted to believe her, that there was no need for my heart to pound so violently, no need for the rush of heat that spread from my chest to my cheeks. But the tension in the room was undeniable, thick enough to catch in my throat. She didn't move away. If anything, she leaned closer, her fingers brushing against mine again. This time, the contact lingered, her touch warm and deliberate. I looked down at her hand, as though studying it would ground me, but it only made the situation more surreal. Her nails were neatly trimmed, her skin smooth, her fingers curling slightly as if testing the boundaries of what I might allow. You're very diligent, Elise, she murmured. It's one of the things I've noticed about you. The compliment hit me like a bolt, and I glanced up, meeting her eyes. They were sharp, yet soft, a contradiction that only heightened the strange pull she seemed to have over me. Thank you, I managed, though my voice sounded far away to my own ears. I mean it, she continued, her tone gentle but firm. You pay attention to the smallest details, even when others might overlook them. It's a rare quality. I wasn't sure how to respond, so I didn't. The silence between us stretched, punctuated only by the faint hum of the desk lamp. Her hand shifted slightly, her thumb brushing against my knuckles, an emotion so subtle it might have been unintentional, if not for the way her gaze lingered on mine. Do you know why I chose you for this task? She asked softly. My throat felt dry. Because you thought I'd be a good fit? No, of course not. She smiled faintly, a knowing curve of her lips. Partly, but also because I wanted to see how you'd handle yourself in a more intimate setting. The word intimate sent a shockwave through me, and I couldn't help the way my pulse quickened. I'm not sure I understand. Her head tilted slightly, the motion almost playful. Don't you? I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. There was something about the way she was looking at me, the way her hand still lingered on mine, that made it impossible to think clearly. I think you do, she said after a moment, her voice dropping to a near whisper. And I think you're curious. My breath hitched, and I felt my cheeks flush. Was I? The truth was, I didn't know. Or perhaps I did. But I wasn't ready to admit it. Not to her, and certainly not to myself. Curiosity, she continued, is a powerful thing. It can lead to understanding, to growth, but it can also be dangerous. Her fingers trailed over mine, her touch light but deliberate. Tell me, Elise, are you willing to take that risk? This commitment means so much to me. I stared at her, unable to look away. My heart was pounding, my thoughts a chaotic jumble, but beneath the confusion was something else, something undeniable. Yes, I said finally, the word escaping before I could second guess it. Her smile deepened, and for a moment she simply studied me, as though weighing my answer. Then, slowly, she withdrew her hand, the loss of her touch leaving a strange emptiness in its wake. Good, she said, her tone steady again. That's the first step. She moved away, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she walked to the shelves. I watched her, my pulse still racing, as she pulled another book from the collection, then set it on the desk in front of me. The moment had shifted, the air between us still charged, but tempered by a layer of restraint. This one, she said, her fingers brushing over the cover, is even more complex than the last. I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. I nodded, though my hands trembled slightly as I opened the book. The pages were filled with intricate illustrations and densely packed text, but I could barely focus. My mind was still reeling from what had just transpired, from the way her words had pierced through my defenses like a scalpel. She stood behind me again, her presence as inescapable as the pull of gravity. I felt her breath against the back of my neck as she leaned over my shoulder to point at a passage. Here, she said, her voice low and velvety. This part is particularly compelling. What do you make of it? I forced myself to read the lines, though the meaning slipped through my grasp like water through a sieve. It's evocative, I said finally, hoping the answer would suffice. She chuckled softly, the sound rich and intimate. Evocative, that's one way to put it. Her hand rested lightly on the back of my chair again, her fingers grazing my shoulder as she spoke. Tell me, Elise, what does it evoke in you? I hesitated, my eyes flicking to the words on the page, as though they might offer some kind of clarity. I'm not sure. Her fingers tightened slightly, the pressure grounding, yet suggestive. Take your time, she said. There's no rush. I nodded, though my focus was fractured, split between the text in front of me and the woman standing so close I could feel the heat of her body. The tension between us was a living thing, growing with each passing second, and I couldn't tell if it thrilled or terrified me. Sometimes, she murmured, her voice like a caress, what we feel can be just as important as what we understand. Don't be afraid to let yourself feel, Elise. Her words sent a shiver through me, and I turned my head slightly, meeting her gaze. There was something in her eyes, something raw and unguarded that made my breath catch. I began, but whatever I was about to say was lost as she leaned in closer, her lips hovering just inches from mine. For a moment, time seemed to stop, the world narrowing to the space between us. And then, as though some invisible barrier had been breached, she closed the distance, her lips brushing against mine, in a kiss that was as soft as it was unexpected. The kiss was feather-light, almost hesitant, but it carried an intensity that left no room for misinterpretation. My breath caught, and for a moment I froze, every nerve in my body tuned to the sensation of her lips against mine. Time seemed to fold in on itself, the world narrowing until there was only her warmth, her scent, her quiet insistence. When she pulled back, her eyes searched mine, her expression unreadable. Too forward? She asked, her voice soft but steady. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my ears. No, I whispered, the word escaping before I could question it. Her lips curved into a faint smile, and she brushed a strand of hair behind my ear, the gesture as intimate as the kiss had been. Good, she murmured, her thumb grazing my cheek, in a touch that was both tender and electrifying. Because I don't think I can apologize for this. I didn't know how to respond, so I didn't. Instead, I let the moment stretch between us, heavy with the weight of what had just happened and the unspoken possibilities that lingered in its wake. You're still trembling, she said, after a moment, her tone soft but edged with something deeper. Are you afraid? I shook my head, though the truth was more complicated. I wasn't afraid of her, not exactly. It was the enormity of what her kiss had awakened in me that left me unsteady. The realization that I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. No, I said finally, my voice steadier this time. Not afraid. Her gaze softened, and she leaned in again, her lips brushing against my temple in a gesture that was both reassuring and disarming. Then let's not pretend, Elise. Not here. Not now. I exhaled shakily, the sound catching in my throat as her hand moved to the back of my neck, her fingers threading through my hair. She was so close, her presence overwhelming, and I felt myself leaning into her touch without meaning to. The second kiss was different, deeper, more deliberate. There was no hesitation this time, no question of intent. Her lips moved against mine with a confidence that stole my breath, and I found myself responding instinctively, my hands gripping the edge of the desk as though it might anchor me. The room seemed to tilt, the walls receding into shadows as the kiss deepened. She pressed closer, her body a warm, insistent presence against mine, and I felt her hand slide down to my arm, her fingers tracing a slow, deliberate path that left a trail of heat in its wake. When she finally pulled away, her breathing was as unsteady as mine. Her forehead rested lightly against mine, and I could feel the faint tremor in her fingers as they brushed against my cheek. This changes things, she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I fully understood what she meant. Is that bad? She pulled back just enough to look at me, her eyes searching mine. Not bad, she said after a moment, but different. Her hand lingered on my face, her thumb tracing a gentle line along my jaw. You've always been exceptional, Lise. Brilliant, insightful. And now I see there's more to you than even you realize. And this book, which is beautiful, will help you find that one thing. Excitement, gratitude, fear. I blinked, startled by the raw honesty in her voice. Professor Hartley, she corrected, her lips curving into a faint smile. Here, I'm just Hartley. The intimacy of her words, paired with the quiet intensity of her gaze, sent a shiver through me. She was watching me so closely, as though searching for something just beneath the surface. And I felt myself needing to meet her expectations, even if I didn't fully understand them. Hartley, I said finally, the name unfamiliar on my tongue, but no less powerful for it. This, I don't know what this is. It's a poem worth 1,000,000 copies. She smiled, her expression softening. Neither do I, she admitted. But I know what it feels like, and I think you do too. Her words struck something deep within me, and I looked away, unable to hold her gaze. She reached out, her fingers tilting my chin gently until I met her eyes again. It's all right to be uncertain, she said, to not have all the answers. That's how we grow. I nodded, though my thoughts were still a chaotic jumble. What happens now? Her smile deepened, and she leaned in, her lips brushing against my forehead, in a gesture that was surprisingly tender. Whatever we want to happen, she said simply, but only if you're willing. The weight of her words settled over me, and I realized she wasn't asking for an answer, not yet. She was giving me space, allowing me to decide what I wanted, what I was ready for. I need time, I said, finally, the confession tumbling out before I could second guess it. She nodded, her expression understanding. Of course, take all the time you need. Her hand lingered on mine for a moment longer before she stepped back, the distance between us both a relief and a loss. She adjusted her blouse, her movements measured, and gestured toward the book on the desk. This, she said, her tone returning to its usual steadiness, will wait. For now, let's call it a night. As we parted ways at the library doors, she paused, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the frame. Elise, she said, her voice soft but firm. Don't overthink it. Some things are meant to be felt, not analyzed. I watched her walk away, her silhouette fading into the night, and felt the echo of her words settle in my chest. Something had shifted. Something profound and irreversible. And I wasn't sure I'd ever be the same. The next few days passed in a haze, my thoughts consumed by the memory of her touch, her voice, the way she had looked at me as though I were the only thing that mattered. I replayed the moment in the archives room over and over, searching for meaning, for clarity, but none came. All I knew was that something had awoken in me, a need, a curiosity that refused to be ignored. When Professor Hartley's email arrived late Thursday evening, my heart leapt at the sight of her name in my inbox. The message was brief, professional in tone, but carrying an unmistakable undercurrent. Subject: follow up on the manuscript. I'd like to continue our discussion from the archives. Are you available tomorrow evening? Best? Heart. I stared at the words, my fingers hovering over the keyboard as my pulse raced. She had signed it simply as Hartley. A subtle reminder of the intimacy we had shared. After a moment's hesitation, I typed my response. Subject: Re. Follow up on the manuscript. Scrimshaw. Hartley, I'm available. What time should I meet you? Pest. Elise. Her reply came minutes later, as though she had been waiting. Subject: Re. Follow up on the manuscript. 7 p.m. My office. The manuscript has a lot more to reveal. Hartley, the choice of words made my breath hitch. The manuscript, yes, but what else might be revealed? You may be in Amsterdam, but it's a different story in Italy, with different rules and expectations. The next evening, I stood outside her office, my nerves frayed, as I smoothed the front of my sweater for the third time. The hallway was deserted, the campus quiet, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead only added to the stillness. I knocked, the sound echoing too loudly in the silence. Her voice, low and inviting, called from within. Come in. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was warm, the scent of her perfume faint but unmistakable. She stood near her desk, her blazer draped over the back of her chair and the top buttons of her blouse undone, revealing the delicate curve of her collarbone. She smiled when she saw me, a quiet, knowing smile that sent a shiver down my spine. Punctual, as always, she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Please, sit. I obeyed, my movements stiff as I perched on the edge of the seat. She watched me for a moment before sitting down herself, her posture relaxed, but her gaze intent. Thank you for coming, she said, folding her hands on the desk. I've been thinking about our last meeting. So have I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Her smile deepened, and she leaned forward slightly, her fingers brushing the edge of the desk. And what have you decided? I hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on me. I don't know, I said finally, but I know I can't stop thinking about it. Her eyes softened, and she reached out, her hand covering mine where it rested on the desk. The warmth of her touch was grounding, and I felt my breathing steady under her gaze. Neither can I, she said quietly. Thank you, she said to her maid as she put on her dinner jacket. The admission hung between us, raw and unguarded. Her fingers tightened slightly around mine, and I looked up, meeting her eyes. There was no hesitation there, no doubt, only a quiet certainty that both thrilled and terrified me. I don't want you to feel pressured, she continued, her voice low. But I also don't want to ignore this. What's between us? What's between us? My heart pounded, and I felt the walls around me begin to crumble. Just, neither do I. Her smile returned, faint but filled with something I couldn't quite name. Then let's not. She stood, her movements slow and deliberate, and came around to the desk to stand before me. I looked up at her, my breath catching as she reached out, her hand cupping my cheek with a tenderness that made my chest ache. You're remarkable, Elise, she murmured, and I don't want to pretend I don't see that. Before I could respond, she leaned down, her lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was both familiar and new, tentative yet unrestrained. I reached for her instinctively, my hands finding their place on her waist as I stood, closing the distance between us. The kiss deepened, her fingers threading through my hair as she pulled me closer. There was no hesitation now, no second guessing, only the weight of her against me, the warmth of her lips, the quiet hum of electricity that coursed between us. When we finally parted, her forehead rested against mine, her breathing as uneven as my own. This is uncharted territory, she whispered, her voice filled with both wonder and vulnerability. I nodded, my fingers curling against the fabric of her blouse. I'm willing to explore it. Her smile widened, and she pressed a kiss to my temple before pulling back, her hands resting lightly on my shoulders. Then let's take it one step at a time. We spent the rest of the evening in quiet conversation, our words interspersed with shared glances and lingering touches. The lines between professor and student, mentor and mentee, had blurred beyond recognition, replaced by something far more complex and far more exhilarating. When I left her office that night, the campus bathed in moonlight, I felt a strange sense of peace. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges and risks, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid. We had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed, but I didn't want to go back. Whatever lay ahead, I knew it would be worth it. As I walked away, her words echoed in my mind. Some things are meant to be felt, not analyzed, and for once, I was content to let myself feel